word for today is Romans 1:17. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. When we came together last time, we looked at verse 16, which Paul says, For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. A little over 500 years ago, there was an event that shook the religious world. It's called the Reformation. Martin Luther had been studying the book of Romans and had found that what he had believed for so many years about the Roman Catholic Church and his own religious standing before God was wrong. His conscience was condemning him. He had been trying for so hard to live a righteous life that would please God and to be made right or just in his sight. Yet he knew that what he was doing was not sufficient. And he grew in his hatred and his anger against God. And then as he studied Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, he found that there was something very unique about this verse, that righteousness which he did not like at all was actually the righteousness that he so desperately needed. If you go to Geneva, Switzerland, you'll find a wall there that many refer to as the Reformation Wall. The four prominent figures on that wall are William Farel, John Calvin, Theodore Beza, and John Knox. But inscribed upon the wall in large letters across the entire wall are these words, Post tenebras lux, after darkness, light. This phrase, after darkness, light, refers to what actually happened during the Reformation, whenever the gospel of Jesus Christ was recaptured and reclaimed out of the darkness of the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church taught that men were saved by their own righteous works and the works of the church, whereas the gospel taught that men are saved because of God's work and Christ's righteousness being applied to them, hence the light. When we come to the text here, we find that this verse, verse 17, no doubt would have been the hinge upon which the door of the Reformation swung. Martin Luther found it to be the very one that brought him out of darkness into light. Let's look at the words of the text. It begins with the word for, which is the Greek word gar, which takes us back to the previous verse. Paul was reminding us that he's not ashamed of the gospel of Christ because it, that is the gospel, is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes. And then he tells us now the reason why it is the power of God for salvation is because of the righteousness of God that is revealed in the gospel of Christ. And that answers the question that has been raised ever since man has existed. How can a man be made right with God? In fact, in the Old Testament, in the oldest book of the Bible, the book of Job, in chapter 25 and verse 4, Job says, How then can man be righteous before God? Or how can he be pure who is born of a woman? That is the question. How can a sinner be made right with God? How can someone who has violated the law of God thousands of times be forgiven of that sin rightly and justly, and then be made righteous so that he can go to heaven and be with God? And Paul is telling us here that the good news, the euangelion, is it. For in it, what? The gospel of Jesus Christ. That righteousness that we need is revealed. Now, Martin Luther, whenever he was studying this text, initially he had learned it in the Latin text. And the word justification, which is the same word we get our word righteousness from, the word justification is the Latin word justificare. And the word justificare was a Roman judicial term, and it referred to being made righteous. Someone was actively made righteous. But he was looking at it in this text in the Greek. And the Greek word is dikaios or dikaiosune, which is the word that refers to a declaration of righteousness or being counted as righteous or regarded as righteous. And so whenever Martin Luther looked at the text here in verse 17, he found that there was something very unique that Paul was saying here. That this gospel is declaring to us, this good news of Jesus Christ is declaring to us, that men can be made righteous, not because of what they actively do, but rather because they are given something that is of God. And that's important to understand. It's not that men are righteous, but rather God is righteous. And God gives men what they do not have, righteousness. So he tells us in the text here that this gospel is indeed revealed. This is the Greek word apocalypto. It simply means to bring to light, to bring out what is hidden. It's the same word that we get our word revelation from, for the book of Revelation, the apocalypse, the unveiling. And so the gospel is the unveiling of the true righteousness of God for men, because they are the ones that shall live by faith. Now, some commentators say that this word here, translated the righteousness of God, refers more to the character of God than the gift of God of righteousness. Some would call it a subjective genitive, that is talking about that the gospel itself declares the righteousness of God, the holiness of God, the purity of God. And no doubt that is true, because in Romans chapter 3, it clearly teaches us in verse 24, 25, and 26 that when Jesus died on the cross, the very holiness and righteousness and justice of God was declared. It was put on display whenever Jesus Christ is called there in that text a propitiation, or the satisfaction of the wrath of God. Or another way of saying that is the satisfaction of the justice of God. So clearly the gospel does make it clear. It is clear that the gospel teaches us that God is a righteous God. He will not compromise his character to save you. He will not compromise his justice and his righteousness to forgive you, but rather he will send Jesus Christ to die and to satisfy the just demands of the law so that he can forgive you of your sin and take you to heaven to be with him. But I'm not sure that's what this text here is referring to. Although what I told you is true about Romans 3, here what Paul has in mind is the righteousness of God that is given to us from faith to faith. And then he says, the just shall live by faith. So he has in his mind the one who believes, the Jew first, and also the Greek, and the salvation that we receive, and that all can receive who believe. And then he talks about that is revealed from faith to faith. The just one, or the just man, shall live by faith. And so he's talking about now, how is it that this man who is an unrighteous person, a sinner, can be made righteous? Well, this gospel actually reveals it. And it reveals the righteousness of God. That means the source or the origin of our righteousness comes from God, not from man. You and I cannot actively save ourselves. We are saved passively, and this is so important for you to understand. You and I cannot save ourselves, and Martin Luther had to understand this, and this verse brought it to light for him. He understood that all the works that he had done, all the effort that he had given to save himself through the Roman Catholic religion was not going to save him at all. None of his active righteousness was going to save him, because he knew that his righteousness was filthy rags in the sight of God. Rather, the only way he would be saved is if someone gave him, that's the idea of passive, someone gave him righteousness, and it would have to be perfect righteousness, perfect purity, perfect holiness. And that is the word here when we have the righteousness of God. It says it's revealed from faith to faith. That's ek is the Greek word from, out from, or by. And then to is the Greek word eis, and it means unto faith, or with the accusative word here, faith, direct object. The idea is that we are saved from or through the means of faith unto the goal of faith. And clearly put, as Paul would define for us in the book of Romans, he's referring to the fact that we are initially justified or made just in the sight of God. And that is the beginning of our faith, out from faith, unto the goal, which is holiness or sanctification. So salvation is not just a one-time event, it's an ongoing process. And so you are experiencing that whenever you are justified, and then you are being sanctified, and then you will eventually be completely sanctified and holy in the sight of God forever in heaven. And so in this text, it says that that righteous perfection of God is revealed from the very beginning of salvation all the way through the end of it. Now, just to add this point, there are some who believe that this refers to just every individual salvation, that the way to read this would be that the righteousness of God in the gospel of Christ is being made known and being made clear from every act of believing unto every act of believing. Or you could read it like this: revealed from faith to faith to faith to faith to faith. Every individual salvation, again, proves the reality that salvation is through faith alone in Christ. Now, the last of the text, Paul quotes a text in the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, which says, "The just shall live by faith." And the point is this is the way it has always been. The just man, the just one, shall live, future tense, by faith. And this doesn't mean that you are living in the sense of blindly and you have to live by faith and not knowing where you're going. The point is that you will live in the sense of justification. You won't be condemned. You won't be sent to hell. And you shall live in the sense of holiness, and you will experience the true life of God in your soul. Both are included in that idea. But who's the one that will live? It's the one who is righteous. And how is he righteous? He receives the true righteousness of God. That's how he gets righteous. And that comes through faith, not through something active that he does, but rather something that God does to him. This is also discussed in Romans chapter 3 and verse 19, where the Apostle Paul writes, "For we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and that the whole world may become guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, or the works of the law, no flesh," that means no man, no woman, no child, "will be made or declared righteous in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin." The law was never given to save you. It was given to show you your need for salvation. And no one will ever be saved by trying to live a good life or keep the laws of God or going to church or anything like that. Men will be saved whenever God acts upon them and saves them by giving them his righteousness. And that's the rest of the text. In verse 21, he says, "But now the righteousness of God," there's that phrase we found in verse 17, "apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even," here it is again, "the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and upon all who believe." And the point is exactly what he says in Romans 1:17, that we're all saved by being given this, the righteousness of God, through not what we do, not what we add, but rather through faith in what Jesus Christ did and accomplished on the cross. Martin Luther wrote, in regards to his struggle with the verses that I shared with you earlier and the topic of the righteousness of God, he said, and I quote, "I hated the phrase, the righteousness of God, which I had been taught to understand philosophically in the sense of the formal and active righteousness by which God is just and punishes unrighteous sinners. Although I lived an irreproachable life as a monk, I felt that I was a sinner with an uneasy conscience before God. Nor could I believe that I had pleased him by the satisfaction I could offer. I did not love, nay, in fact, I hated this righteous God who punished sinners. And if not with silent blasphemy, then certainly with great murmuring. I was angry with God, saying, as if it were not enough that miserable sinners should be eternally condemned by original sin with all kinds of misfortunes laid upon them through the Old Testament law, and yet God adds sorrow to sorrow through the gospel and even brings his righteousness and wrath to bear upon us through it. Thus I drove myself mad, with a desperate and disturbed conscience, persistently pounding upon Paul in this passage, with a parched and burning desire to know what he could mean. At last, God being merciful. As I meditated day and night on the connection of the words, namely, the righteousness of God is revealed in it, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And there I began to understand the righteousness of God as that by which the righteous man lives by the gift of God, namely by faith. In this sentence, the righteousness is revealed to refer to a passive righteousness by which the merciful God justifies us through faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. In this I felt myself straightway born again, and to have entered through the open gates into paradise itself. From that moment the whole face of Scripture was changed. And now, in the same degree as I had formerly hated the word righteousness of God, even so did I begin to love and extol as the sweetest word of all. Thus was this place in St. Paul to me the very gate of paradise. And that is the word for today.